Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm sitting here with a friend of mine, not just a professional associate, but an actual friend, Corey DeAngelis from the American Federation for Children. Corey, it's so nice to finally sit down with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You are a school choice warrior. And before we even get into school choice, I just want to give a little bit of background on how we met. Now, if you want to see other great videos like this, if you want exclusive early access to videos like this, join us at the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. It is lizwheelershow.com/locals. You get to see videos like this a week ahead of time, at least a week ahead of time before everyone else. Corey, so you and I became personal friends, not just professional associates, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, because Harvard University was going to host a conference that was not just pro-public school, but actually anti-homeschooling. And you and I started communicating on Twitter because their argument wasn't just that homeschooled children are more likely to be abused, which is statistically incorrect. The argument went further than that.
Yeah, and they were pretty much using the exception to prove the rule. I mean, just imagine if someone were to say that because there might be bullying and some abuse in the government schools, we should just abolish all government schools. That's using the vast exception to try to make policy for everybody else. And then they tried to apply the same logic to parents. And should we not allow 100% of the population to choose to homeschool because 0.0001% might make a bad decision for their kid? No, obviously not. And look, the evidence is pretty clear. If you look at a peer-reviewed study at the Journal of School Choice by Brian Ray, published in 2017, a systematic review of all the evidence on the subject, homeschool students tend to do better than children in government-run schools on math and reading outcomes, and social outcomes are about the same if you look at the broad sense of the research. But look, they'll try to make the argument that homeschool kids aren't socialized well enough.
Well, I always ask, too, in response to this question, the reason that it's important to talk about homeschooling, by the way, is because the number of homeschooled children in our country has doubled since the pandemic. We're not talking about Zoom school. We're not talking about government school via your laptop at home, hours and hours a day. We're talking about true homeschooling. The number of children has doubled. And so the left is making this concerted effort to attack homeschooling. They even want to abolish it. They make an argument that I find to be much worse than just their provably false argument about homeschooled children being more likely to be abused. They're not. Public school children are the most likely to be abused by teachers and by their parents. They make an argument, though, at least Elizabeth Bartholet, she's a professor at Harvard who was going to run this conference until I think COVID shut it down, and maybe they did it virtually. Maybe you shut it down, maybe we shut it down. I don't know. I don't know who gets the credit here. But she makes an argument that just by nature of, quote, depriving a child of a public school experience, that in and of itself constitutes abuse. That's the definition of abuse in her mind. Not that children who are homeschooled are more likely to suffer parental abuse, but that just not sending a child to a public school is abusive in and of itself.
It's just totally absurd. It takes a village kind of mentality. And we saw this with the Michigan Democratic Party. They posted on Facebook the same kind of mentality. They thankfully deleted it a couple of days later, but they showed their true colors, let the mask slip, and then they deleted the post and tried to issue a quasi-apology because their whole argument in the post was that, parents shouldn't decide what the kids learn. It should be more of a community-based decision. Like your kids belong to the community or the government instead of parents being the primary decision makers of their kids' education. With Elizabeth Bartholet, she was essentially calling for a ban on homeschooling. In order to homeschool, you had to make an argument to politicians or whatever people in power as to why you should have the right to educate and raise your own kids at home. And even then, though, she also said that even if you had the privilege to do so, she would still require a couple of classes at the government school.
Or curriculum standards set by the government. I know in California, they tried to implement certain history curriculum standards for homeschooling, which means they wanted indoctrination that would have otherwise just been in the public school to be taught at home to children, taught by their parents as well. Again, this is, I said at the very beginning of this year that last year we saw parents take over school boards. We saw them push back on school choice issues. We saw them push back on masks. We saw them push back on critical race theory, on transgender bathrooms. And I said the left is going to take this a step further in 2022. They're going to go right for the jugular. They're going to go for parental rights. They're going to try to separate families, and they're going to make this argument that children are not under the dominion of their parents, that children actually belong first, primarily, to the state, that the state has, in the hierarchical structure, that the state is at the top. And I think this is what we're seeing with these attacks on homeschooling, because this is such a fundamental right of parents to be involved in how to educate their children. So I think we're going to expect more of this. What do we do as a society? What do the people watching us today, listening to this interview, what do they do to fight back against this? Because one more caveat, it's really important for conservatives not just to play defense on these issues, to try to stop the attacks once they've already been waged, but to get ahead of the game and to play offense to cut them off at the pass.
Yeah, I would say let it happen. Let these people come out and try to take parental rights away, because the more that they talk about these things in public, the more it blows up in their face. I mean, remember the Virginia gubernatorial election with Terry McAuliffe on the final debate stage? He said, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. He tried to triple down and quadruple down on the anti-parent rhetoric, but it didn't work out too well for them. In a state that went 10 percentage points to Biden, swung 12 percentage points the other way to Glenn Youngkin, and the main issue was based on parental rights and education. It was the number 2 issue in the election, second to only jobs in the economy. And according to Washington Post exit polling, Youngkin won with those voters by 6 percentage points. You see all this stuff happening in social media. Just a couple of weeks ago, you had a Wisconsin representative say something along the lines that if you want to have a say in your kid's education, then you should just homeschool or pay for private school tuition and fees. My first response was, oh, so only rich people should have school choice?
Yeah.
That if you can't afford that, you should be stuck in the closed government schools? And then 2, this blew up in her face because it came off as being against parental rights and raising your own kids. She deleted the tweet, has at least 6,000 responses at least already. You saw this with the Michigan Democratic Party, deleted a post. So people are paying more attention, parents, than ever. And it's almost like this new special interest group has emerged, parents who want more of a say in their kids' education, and they are not going to sit down and shut up, no matter how many times members of the establishment try to label them as domestic terrorists. Parents are pushing back. They're more mobilized than they've ever been before. And I'm optimistic that these attacks from the other side on parental rights, they're not going anywhere because parents are watching now. But what we have to do is make sure that there's a spotlight on these ridiculous arguments from the other side so that people know what's going on, that their ideological opponents actually think that their kids should be raised in the government schools. That's totally unpopular position.
And it crosses party lines, by the way. That's something that's unpopular with Democrats and liberal parents, too, which is a really good opportunity for conservatives and Republicans, because there aren't many issues where there is a bipartisan agreement on a viewpoint. Usually things are very partisan. So talk to me about how the natural evolution of this is also school choice, and how states across the country, state legislatures, not the federal government, are trying to empower parents to be able to make this choice for their children, whether it be better government-run schools, whether it be private schools, whether it be charter schools, which are a hybrid, or homeschooling.
Yeah. Look, COVID didn't break the government school system. It was already broken. And the past 2 years have simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education all across America, which happens to be a massive, long-existing power imbalance between the government school monopoly and individual families. So parents have woken up, they're pushing back, they're fighting back at the school board meetings, but they're also pushing for school choice. 2021 was the year of school choice, or if you're hip with the lingo by now, 2021 is the year that we decided to fund students, not systems. 19 states enacted or expanded programs to fund students directly as opposed to government buildings. It's the best solution to all the problems that we've seen over the past 2 years. Look, just think about all the battles that have bubbled up in K-12 education. First, it was in-person versus remote. Then it was this curriculum or that curriculum. Then it was this mandate versus that mandate, whether it was this COVID mitigation strategy or that one. But these are all just symptoms of the larger problem, which happens to be a one-size-fits-all government-run school system where people don't have a choice. And families have woken up and started to see that even if a school isn't failing based on math or reading test scores, it could be failing in another way, that it doesn't align with their values. And that really mobilizes parents when they feel like their kids are being indoctrinated for 13 years without exit options. Yeah. The only way out of this mess through freedom rather than force is to allow the funding to follow the child to wherever they get an education. That will lead to better alignment between the values and preferences of the parents and the schools. At the same time, it'll lead to competitive pressures for public schools to not focus on divisive topics, just maybe do some crazy stuff like math or reading. And at the same time, they will have an incentive to do a better job. And
yeah, it's like a win-win-win. It empowers parents to have some control over their children's education, which is their fundamental right. It also improves, you mentioned math and reading scores. It improves math and reading scores because there becomes a competitive marketplace where a child is not just tied to the school that corresponds with their zip code. You can go to a different public school if that public school has a superior educational system, and it helps eliminate that indoctrination in schools, because if you are facing a teacher or an administration in your school district that is indoctrinating, is brainwashing, is teaching terrible values, principles that are un-American even, you can remove your child and your child's money, the money that comes with your child, from that school district, and market forces will dictate if enough parents do that, then the school has to adjust what they do. So as I said, it's a win-win-win here. Now, some of these states, if not all of them, that have enacted these funds following the students, not the system type of legislation, they've had a little pushback from homeschoolers, because there's a provision in these pieces of legislation that says, well, if you homeschool your child, you also get the money that you would have used to send your child to a private school or public school. Some homeschoolers are very wary of that. Should they be?
No, because if you're accepting the money, you're not a homeschooler. So by definition, you can separate it out in the law that if you're accepting the money and using it for things that look like homeschooling, well, you're still an education savings account student, you're not a homeschooler. That should provide separation when it comes to regulations with these types of programs. And then my other response is that this is all voluntary. Parents do not have to accept the money. You can make the cost-benefit decision between additional funding and potential regulations, and then make that decision for your own family. But at the same time, you shouldn't tell other families that they shouldn't be able to make that decision. Third is that if you make homeschooling more mainstream, which is one of the benefits from COVID and the school closures, that if you look at the polling consistently from Morning Consult, starting in April of 2020, every single month, people said that they're now more favorable of the idea of homeschooling as opposed to being less favorable. They're over twice as likely to say that they're more favorable of homeschooling now as opposed to less relative to pre-pandemic perception. So if you make it more mainstream, you'll reduce the likelihood of calls for regulations in the future. And if you get more people participating in private education, you'll have a bigger tent to defend against those future calls for regulation from the government. Because look, at whether you take the money or not, the government might try to come and regulate private education. You're better off defending against that by, one, making it more mainstream and having more people defend against those regulations in the future. So I think it's a step in the right direction. We shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good because, look, the status quo is that 9 out of 10 kids almost are stuck in government-run schools, which are totally regulated and controlled and run by the government. So this is a step in the right direction.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned perception, because I was homeschooled the whole time, K through 12. And back then, 25 years ago, when I was homeschooled, the perception was very different. I was, the only homeschooled kid on my swim team or on my soccer team. And a lot of people thought, well, homeschooled kids aren't socialized. They're weirdos. Maybe their parents are very rigid, religious. There were stereotypes that I don't blame people for holding, because stereotypes are based sometimes on reality. Now, it wasn't the reality in my case, and the perception has changed. So my youngest sister is 13 years younger than me. She was homeschooled as well. And even in that window, the perception of homeschoolers has completely changed. When she did sports and activities, there are whole leagues now, sports leagues and co-ops and organizations dedicated just to homeschoolers in cities, states, and across the country. The perception has completely changed. And I think too, as the first wave of homeschoolers that weren't just hippies or very religious right. As those homeschooled students like me graduated and got jobs and married and began families, and people across the country, the perception changed because we changed the perception. They saw that their preconceived notions weren't true, that we are able actually to have a conversation with somebody else, that we are smart, we graduated from college, that we got married, we have children, that we are self-sufficient, contributing members of society. And that just being successful on an individual basis helps change the perception of as a whole, because homeschooling is different no matter what family you're a part of. It's like a private school. No family does it exactly the same. It's not Zoom school. It's not being tied to your laptop all day. It's an incredible learning opportunity, at least it was in my experience, to not only experience the learning in the academic sense, but in the social sense, in the emotional sense, to see the world, to learn how life works. And to couple those things together is something that I think is missing in school buildings a lot. Sometimes they'll focus on academics and they don't actually focus on the social aspect, or they focus too much on the social aspect and the spiritual aspect and the academic aspect lag behind. But whatever the perception is, I think it's changing. And I think, the silver lining in COVID may be that it's accelerated that perception change even further.
Yeah, totally. We're going to win this in the end because, look, teachers' unions have overplayed their hand, showed their true colors, and at this point, they're actively destroying their own empire. and it's kind of glorious. But look, we're going to win because parents care about their kids more than anybody else, certainly more than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. And the reality is, parents are going to fight for the right to educate their kids as they see fit, harder than anyone will ever fight to take that right away from them. So politicians from all parties would be wise to listen to them going forward.
Yeah.
And we're seeing already some of that backpedaling going on in opposition to school choice and parental rights and educational freedom. Parents are figuring out all across the country that there isn't any good reason to fund failing closed government institutions when you can fund the student directly instead.
Yep.
The money doesn't belong to the government schools. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, whether that's public or private. We should fund students, not systems.
Amen to that. That sounds like a perfect place to wrap up this interview. Corey, thank you for all the hard work you do on this issue. I truly appreciate it. Parents across the country appreciate it. Thanks for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you.
All right, and a huge thank you to all of you watching on Locals on YouTube. If you want exclusive early access to interviews just like this one, join us on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals, lizwheelershow.com/locals. We'll see you again soon. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.